In this section, we're going to have a look at a number of different steps that we can use to tie together the different aspects we've been looking at. And this is drawn from About Face. Inside that, so Cooper and all, they set out a sort of a 6-step process that we can use to go from thinking about the environment inside which we'll be using our application through to establishing and refining what's important for the user, linking this together then into an interface design, and going all the way through to usability testing. So we'll have a look at each of the different steps. You can see them listed here, from initially defining the platform and posture through to thinking about high-level functionality and data elements from the user's point of view, for determining how things are grouped and hierarchically structured, again from the user's point of view, for sketching the interaction framework, and then for testing out some of the key paths through that, the commonly encountered ones, and then ending up with validating and testing the design, even though we'll do elements of that through all of the preceding steps. So the first one, define platform and posture, makes sense. So we want to think about the platform that we're using, and think about any sort of constraints there may be for that if we're using a noisy environment. We'll also want to think about the posture of the user as they're using this particular application, what input modalities they're going to be using. And they provide us with constraints then in terms of how we present information, how we can assume we'll get input in from our users. The second step assumes that what we already have from a goal or a functional point of view, we know what the user wants to accomplish. So we've put all of that in before this, so we know what the user wants to do, and we're now thinking about, okay, so we've established this, we've got our task flows, we know the different bits of it. How do we then have an interface for that particular task or activity that maps onto the user's goal? So there's a bit of modeling that happens in before this. But this step says that, okay, so we know our task, we know our activity that we're doing. For that task and activity, we want to think about what are the things that are important to the user. What types of data, what types of information would the user expect to be associated with this particular task or activity? So if the user is thinking that this particular task activity involves a document, then that's something we will want to have represented inside our interface, and that'll be then revealed to the user through our interface. Now, obviously we have an implementation model behind this, and obviously if the user expects there to be, for example, a document, we're going to have the concept or notion of that inside our implementation model. And similar things apply to what we talked about before, that we don't have to expose everything in the implementation model to the user. We shouldn't. We should only expose the things that are relevant, that map onto the user's mental model. But at this point, it is taking, here's the activity we want to do, is thinking about then, okay, if the user's doing that activity, well, what are they going to expect to see? What information are they going to need? How and what is the user, from their point of view, going to need or require to do that particular activity? We want to capture that information up front. Once we've captured it up front in terms of here's what the user needs or expects to do this particular task or activity, we then want to think about some of the constraints if we're to put this information on screen. So that could involve a number of different questions. For example, if we're identifying different elements, how much screen space are they likely to use? Do we have some that could be small, some that could be big? When we're identifying these different aspects, how do they group or come together? So what things are contained inside other things? And again, this is all from the user's mental point of view. We want to think about how the user would group these activities, how the user might expect to see them, as well as some of the display requirements. So which elements are used together? Again, with the user being inclined to use together. What are the sequences that the user would follow through in terms of interacting or going from one step to the next? And so on. And through all of these here, we want to think about, well, how do we optimize the flow? How are we going to present these in a way that is going to be optimal and logical for the user to follow through in terms of the particular task or activity that they're looking at? Now, we want to take that sort of elaboration and development then of the data, thinking about its arrangement, its position, its size, and to use that then to depending on the platform that we're dealing with, depending on the input mechanisms, to group that together into platform-specific groupings. So things that we think will work given the particular platform and posture that we're working to take those task elements and put them together. So it gives us a chance then to establish our groupings, gives us a chance then to establish our hierarchies about how we think all of these things should fit together in a way that meets the user's mental model, in a way that meets the platform and posture constraints. Once we've done that, so once we've got an understanding of the things that are important to the user, the order in which we might provide them, or the order in which we might then group them together, at that point, and not before that point, we can then start trying to sketch these things out. And almost what we, in terms of those interface design and sketching activities out, we've done the hard work. We've thought about, okay, I have to do a sketch of this. I know roughly how big this item or this element needs to be. I know I want to group these things together in my sketches. And that type of information then helps us visually determine what the sketches should look like. And all of the information we previously highlighted about sketching absolutely applies here. So we may be doing it on paper, using wireframes, using prototype tools. The key thing is to make it easy, to make it iterative, to look at different ways and options of presenting the information. Ideally, we should do this collaboratively, and it's good then to have several people come together looking at different ideas, because it opens up different opportunities, different possibilities that one person on their own may not think about. Step 5 then is where we want to, having done those sort of interface designs and sketches, is to take the key paths. So we can drive these from the persona, we can drive them from the tasks as the typical paths through this, the ones that are most commonly encountered or most likely to be followed by the users. And we want to make sure we test those robustly, that they are logical, they are efficient, they are understandable, they're as easy, as straightforward, as cognitively easy as they possibly can be. So we're going to go through all of those key paths and to test to make sure that they think that they're working. If we find any unnecessary steps or any steps that we think are potentially confusing, we want to get rid of them. And storyboarding is a particular technique we can use there. So that takes us through the actions that the user would do. It helps set them out as sort of a linear story, and that then again helps us be able to identify and to optimize for those key paths. Once we've done the key paths, that's the most important bit. At that point, or this point, is now appropriate to think about the other scenarios, other what-if scenarios. And you can see several of them listed here. One would be alternative scenarios. So this might be a particular one associated with a task, which maybe only 10% of users would do, or only applies to this particular case as you go through. But we still want to test that they work and they're reasonable. Necessary use would be things that would happen infrequently, but the user still has to engage with. So for example, registering or configuring a profile. They don't do it very often, but we still want, again, just to check to see that it all hangs together and we're happy with the way we've designed it. And edge cases, they're similar to alternative scenarios, but they happen sort of capture sort of infrequent but specific scenarios if there's an error or a particular combination of data. And again, we just want to check to see that our applications are robust and can handle those situations should they occur. So key thing is at the bottom here that, of course, we need our interface to be able to handle these alternative scenarios, edge cases, and the infrequent necessary use cases. But they're not the focus of our interaction design. They're based on the normal, frequently encountered use cases that we've defined. Step 6 is to validate and test the design. That's really important. We don't just do a design and say it's done. We have to validate it, we have to test it, and we should assume through that validation and testing that it will change and we will need to change it. And the earlier we can do it, the better, but absolutely we do need to do it. Now, we can use our personas as ways of validating how how the personas might approach or interact with something, and that's really useful. We also want to, and if we can, get real users involved in doing this here. So we can show them different examples of interface designs. We can ask them what appeals to them. We can ask them to identify, to locate certain pieces of information. We can get them to, on a whiteboard, to fill in information on a virtual form to see how they do that, to see what questions they have. So where possible, it's good to get our real users involved in validating our designs as well. And absolutely, we need to make sure we build in adequate time into the overall process. So that's a core element, and we have adequate time then to use the rich and really important feedback that we get from our users to improve the design, and ideally then to revalidate that again if a number of iterations are of use. And that, after that, it ties into and moves into this broad area of usability testing, where we have enough implementation available that we can start to measure things about the user's success rate, or how quickly they can do a particular task or activity, or the number of errors that they make. And the next big section after this, we're going to delve into usability testing in a lot more detail to look at different types of performance metrics, to look at user reported metrics. So we'll have an awful lot to say about that. Usability testing, it is the type of thing that occurs a bit later when we have prototypes set up and a little bit of elements of functionality behind it. Then we can get into more meaningful usability testing. So that's all we have in this particular section. We brought it together at the end then with a series of steps that we can follow, that combined with personas and user and modeling our user goals and thinking about the types of tasks they want to do, helps us piece together a really good quality interface where the user's needs are going to be at the heart of it. It brings us to the end of this particular section, and we'll do a summary now just in terms of thinking about the different design approaches we've looked at and how this all comes together.